You can't be serious.
Victor Hale's laugh cut across the lawn beside Town Hall.
A man with one bag and that old dog thinks he can own Station 9?
Nobody stepped in. Nobody even looked away. Dan Whitaker stood there with $42 left, a worn duffel bag at his feet, and Ghost pressed against his leg. Victor stepped closer.
Walk away before this place makes a fool out of you.
Dan folded the county papers in half and looked toward the abandoned fire station down the road.
Maybe I'm not the one this town should be embarrassed by.
Hours later, Ghost stopped before the 9th locker, staring at the wall like he'd been waiting years for Dan to see it. Behind those lockers was a false wall, and behind it was a sealed door, the secret Dan's mother had carried to her grave. Dan Whitaker woke to the sound of air brakes, sighing beneath him, long and tired, like the bus had carried more than passengers through the dark. For a moment he did not move. He only sat there with one hand closed around the strap of his old duffel bag, and the other resting on Ghost's broad head pressed against his boot. The driver looked back over his shoulder. End of the line. Dan blinked at the rain-streaked window. Outside, a small brick depot sat under a single yellow light. Beyond it, a quiet street disappeared into mist, with a diner sign glowing faintly on one corner and the dark shape of a town hall farther up the block. "Where are we?" Dan asked, though some part of him already disliked the answer. Millstone Falls, Pennsylvania. The name settled somewhere deep, stirring something he had spent years trying not to touch. Dan was 42, though on cold nights his body argued for older. He stood slowly, careful not to show the pull in his lower back, and swung the duffel over his shoulder. The bag had once been army green. Now it was faded, taped at one corner, and light enough to tell the truth about his life. 2 shirts, 1 spare pair of socks, a shaving kit, pain medicine, and a photograph of his mother folded inside a paperback he never finished. His coat was military issue, worn shiny at the elbows, frayed at the cuffs, and still warmer than anything he could afford to replace it with. In his wallet were a veteran ID, a bus receipt, a few old cards from places that no longer expected him back, and $62 in bills so softened by folding they felt almost tired in his hand. Ghost stepped down after him without a sound. The faded service patch on his old harness had come loose at one corner, but Dan had never been able to bring himself to remove it. Ghost was large, aging and quiet, with a silvered back, a white chest, and a muzzle touched by years. One ear stood sharp, the other folded slightly at the tip. He was not the kind of dog that begged for attention. He watched, he listened. He noticed the small changes in Dan's breathing before Dan did. The driver closed the luggage door with a hollow thud. "You got somebody coming?" Dan adjusted the strap on his shoulder. "I'm fine." The words came out the way they always did, clean, flat, practiced. The driver glanced at the empty street, then at the dog. "Diner opens at 6. Town hall's up that way. Appreciate it." The bus pulled away, red taillights shrinking into the wet dark until Millstone Falls was quiet again. Dan stood beneath the depot light and listened to the rain tick softly against the metal awning. He had not meant to get off here. He had meant to stay awake and ride farther, maybe to a bigger town with more benches, more noise, more ways to disappear. But sleep had taken him after the last rest stop, sudden and heavy, nothing like rest. Ghost leaned gently against his leg. Not enough to push him, just enough to bring him back. Dan looked down. "Don't look at me like that." Ghost blinked once, patient as Sunday. Dan almost smiled, but the feeling faded before it reached his face. He reached for his wallet to count the money again, though he already knew the number. His thumb brushed the folded scrap of paper tucked behind his ID. He froze. Then, under the yellow depot light, he unfolded it. His mother's handwriting was thin and careful, the letters slightly uneven from the tremor in her hands during her final year. There was no message, no explanation, only one address, Station 9, Millstone Falls, Pennsylvania. Dan stared at it until the ink seemed to breathe. He had carried that paper for years because it was one of the last things Margaret Whitaker had left behind. He had told himself it meant nothing. Maybe an old friend, maybe a debt she never explained, maybe just another loose thread death had failed to tie. But now he was standing in the town, written in her hand, with rain on his coat, $62 in his wallet, and the only living soul beside him, watching the street as if he remembered something Dan did not. Ghost lifted his head toward the dark road beyond the square. Dan followed his gaze but saw only mist, closed storefronts, and the pale reflection of the depot light on wet pavement. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it back into his wallet. "Not tonight," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he meant the address, his mother, or the ache opening quietly in his chest. Then he touched two fingers to Ghost's head and stepped out from under the awning. "Come on, boy," he said. "Let's find somewhere out of the rain." By morning, Millstone Falls had the washed-out look of a town that had spent the night under cold rain. Water clung to the diner windows in crooked lines, and the sidewalks shone under a pale gray sky. Dan found the town hall just after 8, when the front doors opened and the first clerks came in carrying paper cups of coffee and keys on bright plastic rings. He waited outside until they unlocked the door. Ghost sat beside him, calm and quiet, his coat damp along the shoulders. Inside, the building smelled of floor polish, old paper, and warm air that did not belong to men who had slept outside. Dan stood at the counter with his duffel against his leg and asked about temporary housing for veterans. He kept his voice even, the way a man does when he refuses to sound desperate. The woman behind the desk was kind. That almost made it harder. She clicked through a computer screen, frowned gently, and gave him the practiced look of someone standing behind a locked door. "The list is full right now," she said. "You can call again next week." Dan nodded. She slid 2 forms toward him. "There are a few applications you can fill out." "Appreciate it," he said. He folded the papers once and put them in his coat pocket, though both of them knew forms did not keep a man warm. Outside, he stood beneath the stone steps for a moment, while Ghost leaned his shoulder against Dan's knee. It was not pity. That was why Dan could stand it. Pity had weight. Ghost had presence. There was a difference. The first night, Dan slept behind June's table, the diner with the red sign and the blue curtains in the windows. Not inside, he did not ask. Asking meant hearing no, and he had taken enough polite no's for one day. The back awning stretched over a narrow strip of dry concrete near the delivery door. Dan sat with his back to the brick wall, duffel strap wrapped once around his wrist, coat pulled tight across his chest. Ghost lay in front of him, not sleeping at first, just facing the alley with his ears half raised. The wind moved through the dumpsters and rattled loose lids with a hollow clank. Every time Dan's shoulders tightened, Ghost shifted closer. Around 3 in the morning, Dan woke from a hard, broken dream with his heart racing and rainwater dripping somewhere in the dark. He did not remember standing, but he was on his feet, one hand flat against the wall, breath coming too fast. Ghost rose without a sound and pressed his body against Dan's legs. Solid, warm. "Here." Dan closed his eyes and put a hand on the dog's neck. "I'm good," he whispered. Ghost did not move. "I said I'm good." Still, Ghost waited. After a while, Dan sat back down. The dog rested his chin on Dan's boot, and that was how they stayed until dawn. In the morning, Dan bought a small loaf of bread from a corner market and 1 can of dog food from a shelf near the register. The cashier glanced at the duffel, then at Ghost, then at Dan's tired face. "Need a bag?" "No, Mom." Outside, on a bench still wet at one end, Dan opened the can first. Ghost waited until Dan tapped the pavement twice. Only then did he eat. Dan broke the bread in half, then broke his half again, saving the larger piece in a napkin for later. He ate slowly, not because he was full, but because eating fast made hunger feel too honest. The second day, he used the public restroom at Town Hall to wash his face. He cupped cold water in both hands and pressed it against his cheeks until the skin went numb. With brown paper towels, he wiped the rain marks from his collar and rubbed at a stain on his sleeve that would not come out. Then he looked up. The mirror showed him a man with gray at the temples, a jaw covered in uneven stubble, and eyes that seemed to belong to someone who had been awake for years. He looked away first. Ghost was waiting just outside the restroom door, where the clerk had allowed him to sit. The dog stood when Dan came out, studied his face, then nudged his palm with his nose. Dan gave the faintest shake of his head. "Don't start with me." But his hand stayed on Ghost's head longer than he meant it to. That afternoon, a siren wailed somewhere beyond Main Street. Not close, not dangerous, just a volunteer unit passing through town, maybe an ambulance, maybe a fire truck from the next county. Dan stopped walking. His body did not ask permission. It locked. His fingers tightened around the duffel strap until the knuckles paled. The sound rose, bent around the brick storefronts, and faded toward the hills. Ghost stepped in front of him and leaned back into his knees, heavy enough to make Dan feel the ground again. Dan stared at the wet sidewalk. One breath, then another. A woman across the street pretended not to watch. Dan was grateful for that. "I'm fine," he said, though no one had asked. Ghost looked up at him with those pale amber eyes, calm as a hand on a fevered brow. Dan swallowed, adjusted his coat, and kept walking. By the end of the second day, he had learned 3 things about Millstone Falls. The diner smelled best at closing time. The town hall restroom had hot water only if the left faucet was turned halfway, and nobody looked twice at a man with a dog if he kept moving. So Dan kept moving, past the hardware store, past the church, past the closed movie theater with missing letters on the marquee, past every warm window that belonged to somebody else. And wherever he went, Ghost went with him, quiet and watchful, never asking Dan to explain the things he could not say out loud. By his 3rd morning in Millstone Falls, Dan had started to understand the shape of the town. Not the history of it, not yet, but the way it carried itself. Some towns stood tall even after hardship. This one seemed to lean a little, like an old man resting his palm against a fence post, too proud to sit down, too tired to keep pretending it did not hurt. Main Street ran 6 blocks from the town hall to the river road, its sidewalks lifted by old maple roots, and its faded signs hanging above dark windows. A movie theater still promised a summer comedy from years ago, the missing letters making the title look like a secret nobody cared to solve. Farther down stood June's table, always warm behind the glass, always smelling of coffee, bacon grease, and old sugar. Across from it was Harper and Sons Hardware, though the Sons part seemed more memory than fact. Dan had seen the owner twice now, a narrow-shouldered man in his 70s, with white hair under a billed cap and a face built from weather and suspicion. Roy Harper swept the same front step every morning, even when there was nothing on it but rain. He watched Dan the way small-town men watched strangers, not cruelly, not kindly, just thoroughly. Dan respected that. A man had a right to know what had wandered onto his street. Past the hardware store, the red brick town hall, square and stern, its flag snapping when the wind moved down from the hills. Behind it, old rail tracks crossed a gravel lot where weeds grew between the ties. A plaque near the river said a paper mill had fed the town for almost a century. Then it closed, and after that the depot slowed. The storefronts emptied. and people began leaving with boxes in the backs of pickup trucks. Nobody said the town died. People rarely said that about places they loved. They said things like changed, quiet now, or not what it used to be. Dan knew those phrases. People used them for men, too. Around noon, a cold wind pushed him into June's table. He had enough money for coffee if he did not buy food, and the waitress, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s, with silver threaded through her dark hair, refilled his cup once without charging. No one questioned the faded service patch on his harness. Ghost lay under the table, folded into the narrow space with quiet discipline. A couple of older men sat in the back booth near the window, their voices low but carrying in the way voices do in small rooms. They talked about the rain first, then the county budget, then the price of lumber. Dan looked into his coffee and tried not to listen until one of them said, "They ought to tear that old firehouse down before the roof comes in on somebody." The other man gave a dry laugh. "Station 9? Place has been standing longer than half this town's good intentions." Dan's hand stilled on the mug. Ghost's ears lifted beneath the table. "Most folk call it the old firehouse now," the first man said. "My father never did." "No," the second replied, softer now. "Your father called it the warm door." The words changed the air around Dan. Not much, just enough, the warm door. He did not look up right away. He had learned that questions could make people close faster than silence. Instead, he let the phrase sit there, strange and plain, like a match not yet struck. The men stopped talking when June came by with a pot of coffee. One of them nodded toward the window. "Still can't believe the county's letting that place go." June glanced at Dan, then away. "County lets go of plenty," she said. "Doesn't mean it was empty." Dan felt Ghost shift under the table. The dog was no longer resting. His head had turned toward the east end of Main Street, toward a road Dan had not taken yet. "What's down that way?" Dan asked before he could stop himself. June followed his gaze through the rain-streaked glass. Briggs Avenue. She poured coffee into his cup, though it was already half full. "Dead ends near the old station." "Station 9, that's right." Her voice was ordinary, but her eyes were not. Nothing there now but broken windows and bad memories. One of the old men in the booth muttered, "Not all bad." Nobody answered him. Dan took the hint and said no more. He paid for the coffee with 2 crumpled bills and left a quarter under the saucer, because pride was sometimes smaller than hunger, but harder to kill. Outside, the wind had sharpened. Ghost stepped onto the sidewalk and stopped. He did not pull. He did not bark. He simply faced east toward Briggs Avenue, the fur along his shoulders, lifting as his pale amber eyes fixed on something beyond the bend of the street. Dan stood beside him, one hand in his coat pocket, fingers brushing the folded paper in his wallet through the worn fabric. Station 9, Millstone Falls, Pennsylvania. The town had a name for that place. His mother had kept its address. And Ghost, who ignored most things except weather, hunger, and Dan's breathing, was staring down the road as if someone had called him from the other end of it. Dan swallowed once, slow. "Not today," he said. But neither of them moved for a long moment. Saturday, his 4th morning in Millstone Falls, came in gray and cold, with low clouds pressed over the town like a hand over a mouth. Dan woke before the town did, stiff from another night spent where warmth was something seen through windows, not felt. Ghost lifted his head the moment Dan moved, as if the dog had been waiting in the dark for permission to begin the day. By 8, they were standing outside the red brick town hall again. The doors opened with a dry click, and the same clean warmth rolled out over the steps, carrying the smell of paper, coffee, and polished floors. Dan hated how good it felt to step inside. Not because he did not want comfort, but because comfort had a way of reminding a man how long he had gone without it. At the counter, A different clerk listened while Dan asked about veteran assistance. She was younger than the woman from before, with kind eyes and a voice trained to stay soft around bad news. She typed his name, checked a list, frowned politely, and then gave him the answers he had already learned by heart. The temporary housing program is still at capacity. Click. You can try calling again next week. Click. There are a few additional forms you can fill out. She slid the papers across the counter as if paper could become a blanket if folded enough times. Dan took them. Thank you, Mom. He meant it. That was the hard part. Most people were not cruel. They were only standing behind counters they had not built, handing out answers they did not believe could save anyone. Dan tucked the forms into his coat pocket and turned to leave. Ghost did not follow. The dog had stopped beside a bulletin board in the hallway, his body still, his head angled toward a sheet of paper pinned beneath a church supper flyer and a notice about leaf pickup. Dan took 2 steps before he realized the leash had gone slack. Ghost, he said quietly. The dog did not move. Dan came back, more tired than curious at first. Then he saw the bold black letters across the top of the page. County Tax Auction, Saturday 10 a.m. The paper listed properties in neat rows, each with a parcel number, an address, and a minimum bid. A vacant lot, a storage shed, a condemned house by the rail line. Dan read them without interest until his eyes reached the last line. Former Millstone Volunteer Fire Station Number 9, minimum bid, $20. Under it, in smaller print, was the address. Dan stopped breathing for half a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for Ghost to turn his head and look up at him. Dan reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. His fingers were slower than usual, clumsy in a way that annoyed him. He opened the back pocket and took out the folded scrap of paper. The old crease lines had softened from years of being opened and closed. Opened and closed. Like a wound a man kept checking to see if it had healed. His mother's handwriting sat there, thin and careful. Station 9, Millstone Falls, Pennsylvania. He looked from the auction notice to the scrap in his hand. Same station, same town, same address. There was no thunderclap inside him, no sudden music. Only a municipal hallway, a humming copy machine, and a dog watching his face. His thumb moved over his mother's handwriting. Margaret Whitaker had written those words during her final year, when her hands shook, but her mind stayed sharp enough to hide pain behind small jokes and folded laundry. She had never explained the address. Not before the hospital. Not in the box of belongings he had picked up afterward. Not in the silence that followed him ever since. Dan had carried it because throwing away anything in her hand felt too close to losing her twice. Now here it was, pinned to a county auction notice like some quiet thing that had waited until he was too worn down to keep walking past it. "Sir?" the clerk called from behind the counter. "Are you all right?" Dan folded the scrap carefully before answering. "I'm fine." The words sounded smaller in the hallway than they usually did. He looked at the time on the notice. 10 a.m., less than an hour. He checked his wallet again, though he knew. $62. If he did nothing, he could stretch it. Bread, dog food, maybe coffee if he hated himself enough to call it breakfast. A laundromat if the weather held. A bus out if he chose the wrong place cheaply. If he bid $20, he would have 42 left, and a fire station that probably leaked, rotted, and owed more trouble than any man should buy. It was a foolish calculation, a bad bet. The kind of decision a reasonable person would walk away from and feel proud of. Dan followed the stillness beside him. The dog stood close to the bulletin board, calm as stone, his pale eyes fixed on Dan, not urging, not begging, only waiting. That was worse somehow. Dan could ignore pressure. He had practice. Waiting was harder. He slid the scrap of paper back into his wallet, and looked once more at the line that said Station No. 9. He did not know why his mother had kept that address. He did not know why Ghost had stopped here. He did not know what stood at the end of Briggs Avenue except broken windows and a name older people lowered their voices to say. But he knew the feeling of being moved along. From counters, from benches, from programs full to capacity, from places where every answer sounded polite and final. And for the first time in months, the thought came to him not like hope, exactly, but like a small piece of ground under his boot. What if there was one door nobody could ask him to leave? Dan folded the auction notice number into his memory, touched 2 fingers to Ghost's head, and walked toward the meeting room where the county would sell what the town no longer wanted. The auction was held on the lawn beside Town Hall, though calling it an auction made it sound grander than it was. Folding chairs sat in 3 uneven rows on damp grass. A county employee had set up a portable speaker on a card table beside a stack of clipboards and a metal cash box. People arrived in work jackets and clean boots, carrying paper cups from June's table, nodding to one another the way people do when they have known each other through funerals, snowstorms, church suppers, and property taxes. Dan stood at the back, not in a chair. Sitting made him feel too visible. His duffel rested beside his right boot, the strap looped once around his ankle without him thinking about it. Ghost sat to his left, straight-backed, his coat still damp from the morning mist. He looked less like a stray and more like an old witness. The first properties went quickly. A vacant lot near the river sold to a man in a ball cap who wanted room for equipment. The storage shed went for $35 to a woman who said her brother could use the lumber. A condemned house by the rail line drew 2 bids, then stopped at 100. Each time someone raised a hand, the small crowd turned just enough to see who it was. Each time they understood. Around here, property was not only land. It was memory, gossip, debt, and weather damage passed from one set of hands to another. Dan kept his eyes on the ground until the county coordinator cleared his throat and lifted the final sheet. Last item. Former Millstone Volunteer Fire Station Number 9. Briggs Avenue. Brick and steel structure. Decommissioned in 2022. Assessment notes roof leakage, electrical failure, damaged bay doors, interior water intrusion, and general deterioration. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone exhaled through his nose. The coordinator paused as if even the list had tired him out. Minimum bid is $20. Silence. Not the peaceful kind, the knowing kind. The kind that gathers around a thing everybody has already decided is past saving. Dan looked toward Main Street. From where he stood, he could not see Briggs Avenue, but he could feel the address in his wallet like a warm coin. Station 9, Millstone Falls, Pennsylvania. His mother's handwriting. Ghost's ears lifted. "Do I hear 20?" the coordinator asked. No one moved. A man in a dark wool coat near the front leaned toward another and murmured, "County should pay somebody to take it." A few shoulders shook, but nobody quite laughed. Then Dan raised his hand. It was not high, just enough, but in a small crowd enough is plenty. The coordinator looked surprised. $20 from the gentleman in the back. Every head turned. Dan felt the attention move over him. The worn coat, the duffel bag, the tired face, the dog sitting beside him like a quiet question. He had known worse kinds of scrutiny, but this one had its own sting. It was not suspicion exactly. It was pity trying not to show its teeth. "Do I hear 25?" the coordinator asked. Wind moved across the lawn, lifting the edges of the auction papers. No hand rose. Near the second row, a well-dressed man with silver hair and a tan overcoat glanced back at Dan. His shoes were too clean for the grass. Dan would learn later that his name was Victor Hale, a local real estate broker who bought tired properties and gave them cheaper futures. Victor gave a small smile, the kind that cost nothing. "Hope he bought himself a roof too," he said, just loud enough to be heard by the people nearest him. Dan did not answer. He only lowered his hand and rested it on Ghost's head. The dog did not look at Victor. He kept his eyes forward. "20 going once," the coordinator said. A crow called from somewhere beyond the roofline. "20 going twice." Dan heard paper cups crinkle, boots shift, a woman whisper, "Poor man." "Sold." $20. There was no applause, no congratulations. Just a few people turning away as if the matter had embarrassed them on his behalf. Dan walked to the card table and signed where the clerk pointed. His handwriting looked stiff on the county form. He counted out a $20 bill from his wallet and felt the small violence of subtraction. 62 became 42. A number became a consequence. The coordinator handed him a plain envelope with temporary paperwork and an old key-tagged Station 9. The $20 covered only the county's disposal bid. The repairs, liability waiver, unpaid headaches, and every problem after that were his. The key was heavier than it looked. Victor caught him near the town hall steps before Dan could leave. "Walk away before this place makes a fool out of you," he said. Dan folded the county papers once and looked past him toward Briggs Avenue. "Maybe I'm not the one this town should be embarrassed by." Inside the building, after the auction ended, Dan completed the remaining forms at a counter near the records office. That was when Evelyn Brooks saw Ghost. She had been sorting documents behind a desk, a woman in her early 60s with silver-brown hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She looked up when Ghost shifted his weight. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved from the dog's pale muzzle to the scratched silver tag on his collar. For one quiet second, her face changed completely. Age had changed the dog enough that only the tag seemed to pull the past into focus. Not fear, not surprise alone, recognition, softened by something older. "Where did you get that dog?" she asked. Dan looked down at Ghost. "He got me." Evelyn's mouth parted like she had another question ready, but she folded it away. People in Millstone Falls seemed good at folding things away. She handed him the last form and the key, though her eyes returned once more to the tag. "Station's on Briggs," she said. "Road bends left after the old theater. I'll find it." She nodded, then added, almost under her breath, "Maybe he already has." Dan looked at her, but she turned back to her desk. Outside, the lawn had emptied. The folding chairs were being stacked. Victor Hale was walking toward a black pickup, already on his phone. Dan stood on the town hall steps with the envelope in one hand, the key in the other, Ghost beside him, and $42 left to his name. He had bought what no one wanted. That should have frightened him more than it did. Instead, beneath the ache in his back and the hollow pull of hunger, there was something smaller, stranger. It was too small to call hope, but it was the first thing in days that did not feel like leaving. For once, the door ahead of him would open with a key in his own hand. Briggs Avenue did not look like the kind of road that led to a second chance. It bent away from Main Street past the closed movie theater, past a row of houses with sagging porches and rain-dark mailboxes, then narrowed near a stand of bare maples where the sidewalk gave up and weeds took over. Dan walked slowly, the envelope from town hall folded inside his coat, the old key in his palm. Ghost stayed a few steps ahead, not pulling, not rushing, but moving with a purpose Dan had not seen in him since they arrived. The street ended at a cracked concrete apron, and there it stood. Millstone Volunteer Fire Station Number 9. The building sat under the gray afternoon sky like something waiting to be remembered. Its red brick had gone dark from rain, its bay doors rusted along the tracks. one stuck halfway open, as if the station had started to breathe and never finished. Tall grass split the concrete. Above it all, a brass bell sat green with age, quiet as a throat that had forgotten how to call. Dan stopped at the edge of the apron. For a few seconds he did nothing. $42 left, a leaky roof, a key to a place nobody wanted. He should have felt foolish. Maybe he did. But foolishness was easier to carry than being moved along again. Ghost stepped onto the concrete and looked back. Dan slipped the key into the side door. It resisted at first, metal grinding against metal, then turned with a dry click. The door opened into the smell of old things, dust, damp wood, cold brick, rusted steel, and the faint ghost of engine oil sunk deep into concrete. Dan stood just inside and let his eyes adjust. The engine bay stretched wide and dim before him. Broken glass glittered near the front windows. Water stains marked the ceiling in brown islands. A few tiles had collapsed near the back, leaving pieces of insulation hanging like dirty cloth. Near the drain, a shallow puddle held the pale reflection of the open door. But the building was not what the people at the auction had made it sound like. Not good, not safe exactly, but not dead. Dan walked the perimeter with the slow attention of a man trained to measure shelter by what still held. He put a hand on the brick wall and felt its cold steadiness. No deep shifting, no wide cracks. The beams showed rust, but not rot. The floor was stained and wet in places, but level. The roof needed work, and the wiring would need a cautious eye. Still, underneath the neglect, something remained. A spine, a shape, a stubborn refusal to fall. Dan exhaled, and for the first time that day his shoulders dropped a fraction. "You're not gone," he said quietly. His voice disappeared into the rafters. "You're just tired." Ghost looked at him from the middle of the bay. The dog's ears lifted, and Dan almost felt embarrassed, as if he had been caught saying something too honest. "I was talking to the building," he muttered. Ghost blinked, unconvinced. Dan moved through the smaller rooms behind the bay. There was an old office with a broken desk, a kitchen sink stained brown, a narrow bunk room with metal bed frames pushed against the wall, and a storage closet that smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. Everything had been emptied badly, the way people empty a place when they are not planning to come back. Drawers hung open, cabinet doors sagged. A calendar from 2022 still curled on one wall, its last month never turned. Ghost sniffed each room but did not linger. Then, as Dan returned to the engine bay, the dog changed. It was subtle. His body did not stiffen in fear. He did not bark or growl. He simply turned toward the far end of the bay, where a row of tall metal lockers stood bolted against the back wall. They were painted a dull blue-gray, though rust had eaten through the color in long brown veins. There were 9 of them. Ghost walked straight to the last locker and stopped. Dan waited. "What is it?" Ghost did not touch the locker. He did not scratch. He did not paw at the floor. He only stood there, nose inches from the metal, pale amber eyes fixed on the door as if listening to something behind it. Dan came closer. Probably rats. Ghost did not look at him. Dan crouched and ran his sleeve across the locker's corroded surface. Flakes of rust broke loose under his hand. Near the lower corner, half hidden beneath grime, were 2 letters scratched into the paint. GW. Dan stared at them. Initials. Nothing more. Maybe some firefighter's locker. Maybe some bored hand with a pocket knife years ago. Then Ghost shifted, and the small silver tag on his collar swung into the light from the open bay door. Dan looked down. The tag was scratched nearly smooth, the lettering worn by time and weather, and whatever roads had carried the dog to him. He had noticed the marks before, but never cared enough to wonder. Now he held the tag between 2 fingers and turned it toward the gray light. GW9, Dan's thumb stilled. He looked from the tag to the locker, then back to Ghost. The dog was no longer watching the metal. He was looking at Dan, steady and patient, with an expression Dan had seen only in old men who carried stories too heavy to start. For the first time since the bus left him in Millstone Falls, Dan felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. Not from fear, from recognition standing just out of reach. "Ghost," he whispered, "what do you know about this place?" The dog turned his head back to the locker and lowered himself to the concrete in front of it, as if he had reached the end of a long road and intended to wait there until Dan caught up. Dan spent the next 2 days making the fire station look less like a warning. He did not call it work. Work was something a man got paid for. This was slower, lonelier, and somehow more necessary. He started with the glass, sweeping the broken pieces into careful piles so Ghost would not cut his paws. Then he dragged damp ceiling tiles to the side of the bay, pulled rotted cardboard from a storage closet, and carried out trash left behind by people who had decided the building no longer deserved care. At first, every sound echoed too loudly. Broom bristles on concrete, nails scraping old boards, the hollow knock of a bucket. By the second afternoon, the echoes no longer sounded like emptiness. They sounded like space being cleared. Ghost stayed near the 9th locker most of the time. Sometimes he slept there with his chin on his paws. Sometimes he sat facing it, quiet and alert, like a man waiting outside a hospital room. Dan tried not to make too much of it. Dogs remembered smells, Dan told himself. Old leather, old smoke, maybe food from years ago. But every time Dan looked at that worn silver tag on Ghost's collar, the letters seemed less like an accident. GW, S9. On the second morning, Roy Harper appeared at the open bay door with a paper cup in one hand and judgment in the other. He stood just outside the threshold, eyes traveling over the piles of trash, the swept path, the broken windows, and Dan's coat hanging from a bent hook on the wall. "You know," Roy said, "this place has made fools out of men with better trucks than yours." Dan leaned on the broom. "I don't have a truck. That won't help." Roy took a sip of coffee. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes stayed on the lockers a little too long. People get sentimental about brick. Then the roof reminds them what sentiment costs. "I'm not sentimental." Roy looked at the dog, then at the pile of carefully swept glass. "Sure," Dan almost answered, then let it go. Some conversations were like bad doors. Pushing only made them stick harder. Roy set a rusted crowbar just inside the bay. "Found that in the back of the shop. Bring it back before it starts liking you." He turned and walked away before Dan could thank him. The next morning, there was a cardboard box outside the station door, nails, a stiff broom, work gloves with one thumb patched in duct tape, and a thermos of coffee wrapped in a dish towel. No note. Dan stood over it for a while. Ghost came up beside him and sniffed the thermos. "Don't get used to people being decent," Dan murmured. But his voice did not have much force. He drank the coffee slowly, standing in the bay where the old engines once slept. And for a few minutes, the warmth in his hands felt like something he had not earned and had not been asked to repay. By late afternoon, Dan went back to the lockers. The row was bolted tight against the far wall, 9 tall blue-gray doors with rust down their seams and old nameplate slots emptied years ago. He started at the first bolt. It fought him, so did the second. By the fourth, his back had begun to burn. By the 7th, sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cold. He stopped twice, once because his hand shook, once because Ghost pressed his head against Dan's knee, as if to say enough. "Not yet," Dan whispered. "You're the one who wanted this." Ghost did not blink. The 9th locker was the worst. Its bolts had fused with rust, and the crowbar slipped twice, sending pain up Dan's wrist. He clenched his teeth, waited for the ache to pass, and tried again. Metal screamed. The sound tore through the bay and came back from the rafters. Then the bolt gave, not easily, but it gave. Dan pulled the locker forward inch by inch until its back edge cleared the wall. Dust spilled out in gray sheets. A dead smell of trapped air rolled over him, dry and old. Behind the row was not the same red brick as the rest of the station. It was cinder block, pale and newer, laid in a rectangle too deliberate to be repair work. Dan wiped his forearm across his face and stared. "Well," he said softly. Ghost sat down. The dog's eyes did not leave the wall. Dan lifted his hand and knocked. The sound was hollow, not completely, but hollow enough. He knocked again, lower this time. The same answer came back, dull and waiting. Dan felt the air inside the building shift, though maybe it was only his own breathing. He worked the edge of the crowbar into a seam where the mortar had cracked. At first, nothing moved. Then a chip broke loose, then another. The cinder block facing had been laid to hide something, not to hold weight. Piece by piece, Dan opened a wound in the wall. Dust filled his mouth. His shoulders throbbed. The light outside faded from gray to blue. Ghost remained motionless beside him, as if keeping watch over a memory neither of them understood. Finally, the crowbar struck metal. Dan scraped away the last of the crumbling mortar and found the edge of a narrow steel door set back behind the blocks. It was plain, dark, and cold to the touch. No handle at first glance, only a recessed latch nearly sealed with dust. Across the center, scratched by hand but still readable, were words that made Dan forget the ache in his back. "No man enters here as a burden." He stood there with the crowbar hanging loose in his hand. The sentence was simple. That was what made it dangerous. It did not ask what he had lost, what he owed, or what forms he could prove. It only said he was not a burden. Dan had been thanked for his service by people who stepped away before the silence got awkward. He had been processed, referred, delayed, placed on lists, handed forms, and told to call again. But this door, hidden inside a building no one wanted, offered something no counter had given him. Not help, not yet dignity. Ghost rose and came to his side. Dan placed his hand on the dog's head, fingers sinking into the thick fur. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The old station creaked softly around them, settling into evening. Dan looked at the words again, and felt them reach somewhere in him that had stayed closed for a very long time. "What kind of place was this?" he whispered. Ghost looked at the door as if he already knew. Dan found the latch with 2 fingers and pulled. For a moment, the steel door did not move. It held its place with the stubbornness of something that had been sealed not by a lock, but by years of nobody asking. Then the hinges gave a low, tired groan, and a seam of cooler air slipped out into the engine bay. Ghost stood beside him, perfectly still. Dan opened the door the rest of the way. The room behind it was smaller than he expected, but untouched by the ruin around it. The air was dry. The floor, raised slightly above the slab, had been swept before the room was sealed. A sheet of old vapor barrier still lined the inner wall. No puddles, no broken glass, no mildew. Whoever built this place had done it carefully, then hidden it like something worth protecting. Dan lifted the flashlight from his pocket and moved the beam across the room. There was no safe, no cash box, no stack of old bonds waiting to make a poor man lucky. Nothing like the stories people told when they wanted hardship to end with a miracle. Instead, there was a wooden table with worn edges and 4 mismatched chairs. A blue enamel coffee pot sat in the center of it, chipped near the spout. Against one wall stood a narrow cabinet with winter coats wrapped in clear plastic. On a low shelf were razors, soap, folded socks, a sewing kit, paperback books, and an old radio with its cord wound neatly around the handle. Everything was plain. That was what made Dan's throat tighten. Plain things did not try to impress you. They only waited to be useful. Ghost stepped inside first. Not fast, not curious like a dog entering a new place. Slow, careful, almost reverent. Dan followed, ducking slightly though the doorway was high enough. The flashlight found a photograph on the far wall. 12 volunteer firefighters standing in front of Station 9 on a bright fall afternoon. Some looked new to the work, some gray-haired, all wearing the same uncertain half-smile men wear when told to pose for history before they know they are standing in it. In the corner of the room sat an old dog bed, flattened with age. A gray-white towel lay folded on top, faded nearly colorless, except where a darker stripe ran along one edge. Ghost stopped in front of it, his head lowered. He smelled the towel once, then again, longer this time. His whole body changed. Not fear, not excitement, something quieter. Recognition passing through flesh. Dan watched him and felt the room grow larger around them. Ghost? The dog did not answer, of course. He only lowered himself onto the bed with the care of an old soul returning to a pew in an empty church. He rested his muzzle on the towel and closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. But it was enough. Dan looked down at the tag on the collar. GW, S9. The letters seemed less broken now, less random. Across from the dog bed, a wooden sign hung above the table. The words were hand-painted in dark blue. The paint faded but steady. The warm door room. Dan read it twice, the warm door, the phrase from June's table. The old men's lowered voices. His mother's address in his wallet. All of it moved closer, though none of it fit together yet. On the table lay a ledger book bound in brown cloth. Dust coated the cover, but not thickly. Then he opened it. The first page held a line written in careful block letters. For anyone who came home and found no one waiting. Dan stood over those words and felt something inside him try to step back. Came home. Found no one waiting. He had spent years avoiding sentences like that because they were too accurate to argue with. When his mother died, there had been no porch light left in Ohio, no voice that knew how he took his coffee, no one to ask whether he had eaten in the gentle, nagging way that made a man feel claimed. He had come home more than once in his life. It was the waiting that had been missing. He turned the page. There were names, dates, short notes written in different hands. Coffee, coat, bus fare. Sat 2 hours, no questions. Needed work boots, size 11. Called his sister after 6 months, left before dawn. Took the blue scarf. The notes were not dramatic. No one had tried to make saints of themselves. Each line was small, practical, almost humble. A record of human need answered without spectacle. Dan touched one entry with the tip of his finger, then pulled back before the paper could stain. Ghost sighed from the corner. It was a deep sound, worn and peaceful. Dan looked over. The old shepherd's eyes were open now, fixed not on Dan but on the room itself, as if watching people who were no longer there. Dan moved to the shelf and lifted one of the unopened razors, then set it back exactly where it had been. He opened the coat cabinet. Inside, each coat had a paper tag pinned near the collar. Take what fits, no forms. No numbers, no proof required, just take what fits. That simple trust hurt more than suspicion would have. Dan closed the cabinet gently. The flashlight beam drifted back to the photograph on the wall. At the far left of the group stood a tall man, with broad shoulders, silver hair, and one hand resting on the head of a German shepherd that looked painfully familiar. The dog in the photograph was younger, heavier in the chest, but the folded ear and pale eyes were there. Dan stepped closer until his breath touched the glass. Under the photograph, someone had written names in ink. The man, Graham Walker. The dog, Harbor. Dan turned toward the only witness who had not looked away. Ghost looked back from the old bed, calm, tired, and somehow exposed. The name hung in the room between them. Harbor. Dan swallowed. That you, boy? Ghost's tail moved once against the bed. Not a wag exactly. more like an answer that had waited a long time to be safe. Dan sat slowly in one of the mismatched chairs. The wood creaked beneath him. He held the tag between his fingers again. GW Station 9, Graham Walker, the warm door room. Harbor. Outside, the fire station groaned in the evening wind, broken and damp and unwanted by everyone who had walked past it. But in this hidden room, nothing felt abandoned, it felt kept. Dan lowered his head, not praying, not quite, and whispered to the dog whose past had just opened like a door behind a door. "You brought me home to yours, didn't you?" Ghost rested his muzzle on the gray-white towel and did not look away. Dan did not leave the warm door room that night. Outside the hidden door, the rest of Station 9 settled into darkness, damp and drafty, but inside the small room the air stayed still, almost careful. He found an old lantern on the shelf, turned its knob until a weak yellow glow filled the corners, and sat at the wooden table with the ledger open in front of him. Ghost lay on the old dog bed, his muzzle resting on the faded gray-white towel, eyes half closed but not asleep. Dan turned page after page. The room had been kept by a man named Graham Walker, former chief of Millstone Volunteer Fire Station No. 9, U.S. Army veteran, widower, stubborn signature, neat handwriting. Dan learned that from the records, from old newspaper clippings folded into the back of the ledger, from letters stacked in rubber-banded bundles, and from a photograph tucked between two pages like a pressed leaf. Graham had not written like a man trying to be admired. His notes were plain, thermos refilled. 2 coats taken, 1 returned, sat with Dale until midnight. Mason fixed the heater. June brought soup. At the bottom of 1 page, boxed in pencil, were the room's rules. Coffee first. Questions later. Respect always. Dan read them several times. They were not complicated. Maybe that was why they felt so rare. The world Dan knew liked paperwork before warmth, proof before mercy, explanations before chairs. It wanted a man to tell the worst parts of himself in fluorescent rooms before deciding whether he deserved a blanket. But Graham Walker had built something different behind a row of lockers in an old fire station. A place where a man could come home and find no one waiting, and still not have to stand outside. Dan kept reading. The warm door room had never been official. There were no plaques, no donors, no press photographs of smiling men shaking hands. It had started with firefighters leaving coffee on after late calls. Then someone brought spare coats, then work boots, then bus fare. Then a list of rooms for rent, mechanics hiring, doctors who returned calls, and barbers who did not ask too much. People came when they had no place to sleep, when a job ended, when grief had emptied the house, when pride had lasted longer than money. They came through the side door, they drank coffee. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. Graham wrote about Harbor, too. The name appeared in margins and notes like a quiet heartbeat. Harbor stayed with Ray today. Harbor knew not to move. Harbor slept by the door until morning. Across the room, Ghost lay thinner through the hips than Dan wanted to admit, his folded ear resting against the towel. Harbor, the dog in the photograph, the dog Graham had trusted with silence. After Graham's death in 2023, one entry written in a different hand said Harbor, already 10 by the vet's best guess, had been transferred to a regional veteran support program. Later paperwork showed a new intake name, Ghost. Dan touched the worn tag on the collar, GWS9. "You found your way back," he whispered. Ghost opened his eyes, but did not lift his head. It was the tin box that undid him. Dan found it beneath the ledger shelf, blue with rust at the corners, tied shut with a strip of cloth. Inside were letters, not many, each kept carefully. Some were thank you notes, some were apologies from people who had left before dawn. Near the bottom was an envelope with his mother's name written across the front, Margaret Whitaker. Dan's hands stopped over it. For a while he only looked. The lantern hummed softly. Rain tapped somewhere beyond the sealed room. He opened the envelope with more care than paper required. The letter inside was written in his mother's hand, steadier than the scrap in his wallet, but unmistakably hers. "Dear Mr. Walker," it began. Dan read slowly, as if reading too fast might make her vanish. She wrote that she had been passing through Millstone Falls after losing her job in Ohio, trying to get home with a dead phone, not enough cash, and too much shame to ask strangers for help. She wrote that the man at Station 9 gave her coffee before questions, a coat before advice, and bus fare without making her feel small. Dan swallowed hard. His mother had been proud. Not loud proud, quiet proud. The kind of woman who would patch a sleeve 3 times before admitting she needed a new coat. He could see her at that table, tired and embarrassed, trying to sit straight, trying not to let anyone know how frightened she was. Then came the line that made Dan put the letter down and close his eyes. "My son is overseas. If the world ever feels too cold for him, I hope he finds a door like yours." The room blurred, though he did not cry the way people expected men to cry. His breath simply left him and took a long time coming back. The scrap in his wallet was not random. It was not an old errand or a forgotten address. It was his mother's hope folded small enough for him to carry. She had kept Station 9 because someone there had protected her dignity when life had stripped almost everything else away. And somehow, years later, after missed buses, full shelters, wet sidewalks, and a dog with an old name, that same door had opened for him. Dan pressed the letter flat on the table with both hands. Ghost rose slowly from the dog bed and came to him. The old shepherd rested his head against Dan's knee, not fixing, not asking, just staying. Dan placed one hand on Ghost's neck and the other over his mother's words. For the first time in a long while he did not say, "I'm fine." He did not need the lie in that room. By Monday morning, half of Millstone Falls knew Dan Whitaker had found something hidden inside Station 9, and the other half was pretending not to be curious. News moved strangely in small towns. It did not run. It seeped under doors, settled into coffee cups, and appeared in the pause before someone asked how your morning was. Victor Hale arrived just before noon in a black pickup that looked too polished for Briggs Avenue. He stepped around the puddles in clean shoes, studied the cracked concrete, the rusted bay doors, the broken windows, and then looked at Dan as if calculating the weight of a man's hunger. "I'll make this simple," Victor said. "You sell me the property. I handle the demolition, the permits, the mess. You walk away with enough to rent a room for a while, maybe buy a used truck." Dan said nothing. Ghost stood beside the open bay door, his fur lifted by the wind. Victor glanced toward the hidden room and gave a small shrug. "Whatever you found in there, I'm sure it means something to somebody. But history doesn't fix a leaking roof." The hard thing was, he was right. History did not patch shingles. Memory did not repair wiring. A carved sentence did not buy dog food, medicine, or heat. Dan looked at Station 9 and saw every broken thing at once. The roof, the windows, the old bell, the damp floor. Ghost, older than Dan wanted to admit, moving slower in the cold. And himself a man with $42 when this began, and no proof he could hold anything together for long. That night, Dan sat alone in the warm doorroom with his mother's letter on the table. Ghost lay on Harbor's old bed, his muzzle resting on the faded towel, breathing slow. Dan read the line again, though he knew it now by heart. "If the world ever feels too cold for him, I hope he finds a door like yours." He was still sitting there when Roy Harper appeared in the doorway, cap in hand, looking uncomfortable with tenderness. "My brother came here after Vietnam," Roy said. "Wouldn't talk to anybody. Graham gave him coffee for 3 weeks before he got a full sentence out of him." Roy looked at the sign on the wall. He didn't save him, just didn't let him disappear. Later came Evelyn Brooks, carrying an old folder against her chest. Her father had come to the room after her mother died, she said. He told everyone he was going for walks, but Evelyn had found coffee on his breath and peace in his face. June came after closing, with a pot of soup wrapped in towels. Her mother, she said, had cooked for this room every Friday one winter when half the town was out of work. Mason Reed, a retired electrician with swollen knuckles and a voice like gravel, stood under the bay lights and said, "Wiring's bad, but bad ain't the same as impossible." One by one, the town brought back what it had folded away. Not speeches, not promises, just names, tools, old debts of gratitude, small truths carried too long in private. Dan listened until he understood. They had not only abandoned a building, they had abandoned a way of seeing people before asking what they were worth. The next morning, Victor's offer sat unsigned on the table. Dan turned it over and wrote on the back with a black marker, "The warm door room will open again. Coffee first, questions later." He taped it to the front bay door. Over the next several weeks, the station changed by inches. Roy repaired the side door. Mason checked the wires and cursed with professional affection. Evelyn filed paperwork and found a legal path that did not require Dan to pretend he knew what he was doing. June brought coffee, soup, and a box of mugs from the diner's basement. A handful of veterans from nearby towns came after hearing the story, not to be rescued, but to work. They painted walls, replaced glass, cleaned the bell, raised a flag on the pole out front. Ghost moved among them with old purpose, paint dust on his back, stopping now and then to rest his head on the knee of a man who had gone quiet too long. Evelyn made sure only the restored front room opened first, just enough to be legal, safe, and warm. The reopening was not a ceremony. It was just evening, yellow string lights, folding chairs, hot coffee, soup in paper bowls, and the wooden sign hung again where it belonged. "No man enters here as a burden." The first man to stop at the threshold wore a thin coat and held his hat in both hands. His eyes moved over the room, the chairs, the coffee pot, the people pretending not to stare. "Do I have to fill something out first?" he asked. Dan thought of his mother. He thought of wet sidewalks, full lists, forms that could not keep a person warm, and a folded scrap of paper that had led him home by way of loss. Then he shook his head. "No, sir," he said. "Coffee first." Much later, when the room was quiet and Station 9 glowed against the dark for the first time in years, Dan sat on the front step with Ghost's head resting on his boot. The old brass bell above them moved gently in the wind, not ringing, only remembering how. In Dan's wallet, his mother's address no longer felt like a question. It felt like an answer. He had thought he bought an abandoned fire station for $20. But what he had really found was the door his mother once prayed would open for him. And now, as long as he could stand, he would keep it open for someone else. Which moment stayed with you most? Dan finding his mother's letter, or Ghost remembering the room? Tell me where you're watching from, and if this story touched you, please like and subscribe.